From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Georgette Dorn, and I'm the Chief of the Hispanic Division. It is a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this wonderful library and this wonderful collection. We have the most extensive Latin American, Spanish, and Portuguese collection in the world, and not just books and periodicals, but also manuscripts, maps, voice recordings, music, films, and even artifacts in the Kislak collection, and more than 7 million maps and atlases. So it really is worth peeking in, and beginning with the Hispanic Reading Room, which is a beautiful reading room in the Jefferson Building on the second floor, and it's the oldest foreign area reading room in the library. It began in 1939. So it is now a great pleasure to welcome here David Castillo and Dr. William Egginton and Patricia, and I'm not sure what your last name, but Talia will introduce you. And it's a pleasure to introduce Talia Guzman Gonzalez, who is la madre de este evento tan importante, Talia Guzman Gonzalez.
Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon welcome to the Library of Congress. My name is Talia Guzman Gonzalez, and I am a reference librarian and Luso-Brazilian specialist in the Hispanic Division. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this presentation of Medialogies, Reading Reality in the Age of Inflationary Media, composed a cuatro manos by two great scholars, David Castillo and William Egginton. I am very thankful to Patricia for agreeing to being here and moderating the conversation that I'm sure is going to be really provocative and exciting. I will keep my introduction short so we can move on to the event. But I would also like to invite everyone to stop by the lobby and see the exhibit that the people from Rare Books and Special Collections put together for us today with some wonderful items, including the first edition of Don Quixote. So please stop by and take a peek. So our speakers today are David Castillo. David Castillo is the director of the Humanities Institute at SUNY Buffalo and professor of Spanish in the Department of Romance Languages and Literature, where he served as chair between 2009 and 2015. He's the author of Baroque Horrors, Roots of the Fantastic in the Age of Curiosities, published in 2012. And he is also the co-author of Zombie Talk, Culture, History, and Politics, published in 2016, among other books. His fields of research includes early modern and Baroque studies, Spanish Golden Age, fantasy and horror, and cultural criticism. William Egginton is a Decker Professor in the Humanities and the director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where he also chairs the Department of German and Romance Languages and Literatures. He is the author, editor, or translator of more than a dozen books, including How the World Became a Stage, published in 2003, and The Man Who Invented Fiction, How Cervantes Ushered in the Modern World, published in 2016, and that we had the pleasure to present here at the library. His research and teaching focuses in Spanish and Latin American literature, literary theory, and the relation between literature and philosophy. Patricia Vieira is an associate professor of Spanish and Portuguese, comparative literature, and film and media studies at Georgetown University, and she is also associate research professor at the Center for Social Studies of the University of Coimbra. She is the editor of 5 books and the author of 5 books, including Cinema no Estado Novo, Encenação do Regime, published in 2011. And the forthcoming book that's going to come out in 2018 is States of Grace, Utopia in Brazilian Culture, which hopefully we'll have her here at the library to talk about it soon. She also co-edits the book series Future Perfect, Images of the Time to Come in Philosophy, Politics, and Cultural Studies. And she co-curates a philosophical salon at the LA Review of Books. I should let you know that all of their books are here at the library. So you're welcome to come and read them here with us. So please join me in welcoming David, Bill, and Patricia to the library.
Well, hello everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here talking about this wonderful collaboration that Bill and I worked on. The collaboration itself was wonderful. The results, it's for you to judge. By the way, I've just convinced Bill to go ahead and write a sequel to the book, so watch out for that. The tentative title for the sequel is Humanities to the Rescue. And now we're on record, so we have to go ahead and do it. All right. What I'm going to try and do here is speed through a series of slides that I put together as a spin-off from the book for an event that the UB Alumni Relations Office hosted last night here in town. I had way more time to go through the PowerPoint there, so excuse some of the clunkiness here because I'm going to really try to cut this down to about 15-20 minutes. We'll see. All right. How did we get here? This is one of the most interesting quotes you'll ever read, I think. Ron Suskind, New York Times Magazine contributor, in the summer of 2002, after I had written an article in Esquire that the White House didn't like about Bush's former communications director, Karen Hughes, I had a meeting with a senior advisor to Bush. He expressed the White House's displeasure. And then he told me something that at the time I didn't fully comprehend. The aide said that guys like me were in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. I nodded. That's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We are an empire now, and when we act, we create our reality. And while you are studying that reality, judiciously, as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too, and that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. So this is from Doctor Who, 1977. You know, the very powerful and the very stupid have one thing in common. They don't alter their views to fit the facts. They alter the facts to fit their views, which can be uncomfortable if you happen to be one of the facts that needs altering. There is a brand new technology that allows for diminished reality. Just going to play a little bit of this. All right, well, you get the point there. Things just disappear in front of your eyes, and the technology is so fast that really actually once you program this, the actual filtering in, it can happen in real time. So let's see if I can get back to, all right. Oh, it's going backwards now. There we go. So one possible application of this diminishing reality technology, take Google Glass, the company's overhyped smart glasses, which can automatically snap photos of everything we see and store for posterity. But smart glasses could do so much more. Why not edit out disturbing sights that haunt us on the way to work? Just last year, the futurist Ajisha Khanna even described smart contact lenses that could make homeless people disappear from view, enhancing our basic sense and undoubtedly making our life so much more enjoyable. In a way, this does solve the problem of homelessness, unless, of course, you happen to be a homeless person. In that case, Silicon Valley would hand you a pair of overpriced glasses that would make the streets feel like home. To quote an ad for Samsung's fancy TV sets, reality, what a letdown. All right, and here we go. This would be augmented reality.
Everything started with this selfie. It shows 18-year-old Syrian refugee Anas Modamani with the most powerful woman in the world. The photograph was taken when German Chancellor Angela Merkel visited a refugee shelter in Berlin. Modamani had just arrived in Germany and was full of confidence. Today, almost 1.5 years later, he is disillusioned. His picture went viral around the world, and it is haunting him. Since 2015, it has been used 3 or 4 times for fake news. The first time, my picture was linked to the terror attack in Brussels. The last time they said I was involved in a crime where 6 attackers set fire to a sleeping homeless man in a Berlin subway station. All these allegations are absolutely untrue, but they were published on Facebook and shared more than 1,000 times. Again and again, Anas Modamani and his lawyer reported the images and asked Facebook to remove them. The company says it did. We are sorry to hear about Mr. Modamani's concerns with the way some people have used his image. We have already quickly disabled access to content that has been accurately reported to us by Mr. Modamani's legal representatives, so we do not believe that legal action here is necessary or that it is the most effective way to resolve the situation. But for Anas Modamani, that's not good enough. His lawyer says the images are still in circulation on the platform, and he's taking Facebook to court over it. We want Facebook to delete the picture from the whole network, and for them to make sure it cannot be uploaded anymore. Anas Modamani cannot find out himself where his picture is. It has been shared more than 1,000 times. The only one who is able to do so is Facebook, and Facebook is also responsible for making sure that the picture is not circulated any longer. The trial starts today at a regional court in southern Germany. The case could have enormous repercussions if the judges decide that Facebook can be held accountable for the distribution of fake news.
Well, so the trial took place, and Facebook was not held accountable. So I guess it's this one that's working. Yes, got it. So yeah, so nothing happened there. Let's see. This is another case. It's a little bit longish, so I'm going to maybe we can play it later if there is a question about fake news. If people want to talk about this a little bit more. This is a case in Idaho, actually. It was reported about a week ago. Facebook agrees to release Russian-purchased ads, pledges deeper look at 2016 election. Zuckerberg, as you may remember, rejected the criticism at first, saying shortly after the election that it's a pretty crazy idea to think that fake news on Facebook influenced the election in any way. He added that voters make their decisions based on lived experience. But Facebook had to change its tone early this month when it disclosed that a Russian company known as the Internet Research Agency had bought more than 3,000 politically charged ads worth about $150,000 on its platform during key periods of the presidential campaign, often dealing with issues such as race, immigration, and gun rights. We got a Twitter response. The Russia hoax continues. Now it's ads on Facebook. What about the totally biased and dishonest media coverage in favor of crooked Hillary? The greatest influence over our election was the fake news media screaming for Hillary Clinton. Of course, you may remember this instance here. Let's see, this may not play. But very quickly, this is the a famous interview where Kellyanne Conway coined the famous expression alternative facts. So shortly thereafter, I picked up this article from the internet. The Public Relations Society of America put out a statement on alternative facts condemning the phrase and equating them to lies. Since Conway's statement, many people have recognized the moral and political issue we face if our government isn't being entirely truthful to us. The statement has been called Orwellian, in reference to George Orwell's 1984, which by January 26th had become the #1 bestseller on Amazon. So the question is this reference to Orwell's dystopian novel justified? And I picked up some quotes from the book that seem to make the case. This is straight out of 1984. A few lines of print and a couple of faked photographs, and what was unimagined an hour ago was now fact. There is need for a moment-to-moment flexibility in the treatment of facts. If the facts say otherwise, then the facts must be altered. You must get rid of those 19th century ideas about the laws of nature. We make the laws of nature. We can shut them out of existence. Global warming. There will be no art, no literature, no science. NEA, NEH, anyone? This is the world we're preparing, an endless pressing upon the nerve of power. We could also turn to Aldous Huxley's dystopian novel, A Brave New World, even earlier, 1931. In Amusing Ourselves to Death, originally published in 1985, Neil Postman makes the point that while we are fixated on the Orwellian nightmare of a totalitarian state built on information suppression machines, brutal policing, and physical and psychological repression, our world is inching closer to the brave new world described by Huxley, a society built on the promise of unlimited and instant gratification in which humanity is drowned in stupefying, addictive, sedating, and trivializing media technologies. As he writes, what Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared that we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared that we would become a trivial culture. Sure, 1984 and A Brave New World are eerily relevant, but so is Don Quixote. What do the very powerful fear the most? Clue. Donald Trump did not attend the traditional roasting of the president at the press corps dinner. Spanish fascist ideologue and Franco supporter Ernesto Jiménez Caballero feared the devastating effect of Cervantes' humor, which in his own words had the power to ridicule the mystical and blind pride of imperial Spain. He was referring to the historical empire of the Habsburgs as well as its resurgence or reincarnation in the fascist Spain of the 1930s. Remarkably, Jiménez Caballero calls Cervantes' irony a weapon against stupor, while noting that the stupor of the people is not only desirable but necessary to advance the cause of empire. For him, the publication of Don Quixote was the devastating blow to the blind pride of imperialism that marked the beginning of the end of all the great adventures of Spain. Amazingly, Walter Benjamin agreed with them from the left. Benjamin thinks of Cervantes' humor as the ultimate example of true critique. He is explicitly referring to Don Quixote when he writes, "The magic of true critique appears precisely when all counterfeit comes into contact with the light and melts away. What remains is the authentic. It is ashes. We laugh at it." So where should we look today for this kind of devastating critique of empire? About here. Stephen Colbert uses truthiness on the debut episode of the Colbert Report. Truthiness is a quality characterizing a truth that a person making an argument or assertion claims to know intuitively from the gut, or because he feels right, without regard to evidence, logic, intellectual examination, or facts. He particularly applied it to the President George Bush's decision to invade Iraq in 2003. Colbert later ascribed truthiness to other institutions and organizations, including Wikipedia, which is our source for this slide, by the way. Truly Cervantine there. Colbert refreshed truthiness in an episode of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert on July 18, 2016, using the neologism Trumpiness regarding statements made by Donald Trump during his presidential campaign. According to Colbert, while truthiness refers to statements that feel true but are actually false, Trumpiness does not even have to feel true, much less be true. As evidence that Trump's remarks exhibit this quality, he cited the Washington Post column stating that many Trump supporters did not believe his wildest promises but supported him anyway. And now I have a snippet of, let's see if we can pick it up. I think I may have to go out of here. Well, that was a bit from the roasting of President Bush at the press corps dinner. I think it was like 2006. The basic point that Colbert was making is that President Bush was his hero because he did not change his mind. He was steady. He thought the same. He believed in the same things on Monday that he believed on Wednesday, regardless of what happened Tuesday. So Don Quixote revisited. The hero of Cervantes' novel did not feel the need to change his mind about the things he knew to be castles, giants, and armies, just because these things looked and acted like inns, windmills, and herds of livestock. The famous knight-errant was absolutely certain that the thing that shined on the barber's head was Mambrino's helmet, regardless of the fact that on closer inspection the object admittedly looked and felt like a barber's basin. President Bush did not see the need to adjust his convictions about global warming or Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, despite ample evidence to the contrary, just as Don Quixote continued to hold to his giants and armies of knights, even as he encountered firsthand the bruising reality of windmills and livestock. If, as the above-quoted fascist ideologue Jimenez Caballero suggested, the central tenet of empire, its defining characteristic, is its necessary mystical and blind pride, then the real enemy of empire would not be the properly designated axis of evil, but the demystifying irony that both Jimenez Caballero from the right and Walter Benjamin from the left attributed to the Cervantean legacy, a rich comedic tradition that continues to hold counterfeit notions to the piercing light of truth. From this perspective, the fact that SNL is at the height of its popularity at this very moment in time ought to be taken as a hopeful sign. This is a nice title there, I'm America and so can you. America again, rebecoming the greatness we never weren't. This is from 2012, the book itself, although it reads as a parody of MAGA, Make America Great Again. So back to Cervantes, ridiculing the blind pride of anti-smarts, reality-proof, empire-building fundamentalism. In 1615, Cervantes published a collection of theatrical pieces with the heading 8 Plays and 8 Interludes Never Performed. The collection included 2 humorous interludes that are relevant in light of the present discussion, the election of the mayor of Daganzo and the Stage of Wonders. In the election of the mayor of Daganzo, candidate Humillos, a name based in a clever wordplay that suggests both vain pride and smokescreen, campaigns for the highest office in town. A college graduate asks him a left-field question. Can you even read, Humillos? The candidate's response is as straightforward as it is priceless. Certainly not. And no one will be able to say that a single member of my king would ever apply themselves to learning those chimeras that drive men to the stake and women to houses of ill repute. I come from uncontaminated Christian stock. In the Stage of Wonders, the producer tells the audience that his show will single out anyone who is contaminated by non-Christian blood, for no one can see the wonders that are shown in it if they belong to a tainted race. While the stage remains empty for the entire performance, everyone in the audience will have to pretend to see the dramatically announced wonders to avoid the stigma of contamination, and thus show that they are indeed members of the exceptional community of legitimate Christians and true Spaniards. If we could play with Colbert's language a bit, what the producer of the Stage of Wonders is telling his prospective audience is essentially this: I am Spain, and so can you. Cervantes lessons in reality literacy. Where would Cervantes go today in search for truth in our age of truthiness? Surely he would tell us that the truth is to be found among the victims of our own stages of wonders, the pieces of the world that are removed from view by those diminished versions of reality that shield us from what we don't want to see, say the homeless. And also the victims of our augmented reality, say the Syrian refugee who has become an alternative fact, whose sole purpose is to justify our own fears and to allow us to double down on our chosen reality. Or perhaps the truth can be found in the Netherlands.
Nou, afgelopen vrijdag was het zover. De 45ste president van de Verenigde Staten werd beëdigd in Washington D.C. Donald J. Trump. Hij had een duidelijke boodschap voor de rest van de wereld. Ik neuk jullie allemaal de moeder. Nou ja, hij zei het in iets andere woorden.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
Ja, en omdat wij ook wel inzien dat we hem beter te vriend kunnen houden, stellen wij ons landje even aan hem voor op een manier die hem wellicht het meest zou aanspreken.
This is a message from the government of the Netherlands.
Dear Mr. President, welcome to this introduction video about the Netherlands. It's gonna be a great video. It's gonna be absolutely fantastic.
Notice the windmills there.
Was William of Orange, who fought against the Spanish, total scumbags. They fought against us for 80 years, but they couldn't beat us. Couldn't do it. Total losers. They're all dead now, by the way. We speak Dutch. It's the best language in Europe. We've got all the best words. All the other languages failed. Danish, total disaster. German is not even a real language. It's fake. It's a fake language. We've got Pony Park Slagharen, which has got to be the best pony park in the world. It's true. They're the best ponies. They are. You can ride them. You can date them. You can grab them by the pony. This is the Afsluitdijk. It's a great, great wall that we built to protect us from all the water from Mexico. We built an entire ocean, okay? An entire ocean between us and Mexico. Nobody builds oceans better than we do. This ocean, it is so big, you can even see it from the moon. And we made the Mexicans pay for it. It's true. You've got the Trump Towers, we've got Lee Towers.
This is a message from the President of the United States.
I'm going to have to...
Dear people of the Netherlands.
I'll have to end it there. Right. All right, so Bill.
Okay. So what we thought we would do is have David give this presentation largely related to the current part of the book. The book's focus on contemporary culture. And click to exit. All right, I'm going to have to not speak and do it at the same time. Let's see. Yeah, if you don't mind. And I need to find mine now. And that's great, Talia. And that what I could do is very briefly show a case study of the focus that the book has on the early modern period, so the early 17th century at the heart of a great empire. Then Spain, even though they were scumbags, right? Failed, totally failed. So the book was called Medialogies, Case Study, Emblems in the Framing of Justice. And so what I wanted to do was actually show some reproductions of some emblem books from the early 17th century as an example of one of the fundamental points of Medialogies, which is that our analysis of, and so let's take this great example that David was talking about, diminished reality. And the ideas that certain companies, even Google Glasses, were thinking about this, making, in essence, your way of walking through the world more pleasant to yourself by being able to edit out in real time aspects of your social reality that are disturbing to you. So editing out homelessness was the idea that was actually published at the time. And you saw it working with stuff in your bathroom or stuff on your desk. Well, the first thing that one could say is, well, this is just very technological. And obviously, it depends on enormous technological abilities to do that. Part of David's and my point in Medialogy is that the function of editing out doesn't have to be purely technological. Right? It can happen through what we call in the book framing techniques. And those framing techniques have been available in all times and cultures, one can say, that our understanding of basic reality depends on how we frame it narratively, how we frame it in terms of interpersonal relations, how we frame it in terms of expectations, but that new media emerge and always adopt framing modes at the time. And so if we have electronic media in the 20th century, in the early modern period, so around the beginning of the 17th century, the newly emerging empires were taking advantage of the media that they had at the time. One of them was obviously the print culture, and you have fantastic examples out in the hallway of some of the great bestsellers of the time, and we were, of course, referring to some of them ourselves. But others were theater. The theater in Spain began for the first time in the early 17th century to attract up to 90% of the newly burgeoning urban populations who would go to see the theater, and they would be going and watching the same plays. How were these forms of newly popular culture helping to frame reality? And we thought we would take an example from emblem books, and let's make sure that I'm pressing the right button to do this. Good. So this one comes out in 1610. Very, very popular. One of the great circulating books at the time, and they're made with a combination of printed page, so using the printing press, and wood cuts, and the wood cuts are very high quality. This is from Sebastián de Covarrubias, who's also well known for having produced one of the most important dictionaries at the time, the Diccionario de Autoridades. And so we'll take an example here, and then so that I can actually read it with my poor eyes, I've found ways to, I've taken the actual, there we go. So in this particular, so an emblem, the structure of an emblem is a woodcut print and then a saying underneath. So it's a combination. The readers are supposed to reflect upon an image, and here we have an image of that's supposed to represent a king that's power, but it's also aging terribly and suffering, and it has its paw on the world. This lion, it has the crown on its head, and then underneath there is a, or in the banner, there is a saying, and in this case it says, "What do you think it means to rule?" Question, and the answer, "To serve while dying." So, servir muriendo. The emblem turns the table on the common complaint of the abuse of power. To wield power is to suffer abuse in the service of the common good. It is to give up all pleasure and selfish desires, to be consumed by sacrifice. The face of the lion, like the steer's body, is sagging, the skin loose and hanging, aged early by the cares of office. The front right paw, placed in paternal protection on the orb of the world, is devoid of the violence and fear of the great beast's claws would normally project. It radiates instead a father's benevolence. So then, let me go to another one. Covarrubias in the next one is shifting the suffering of sovereignty inward in an emblem depicting the fatal outcome of the easy road to self-fulfillment as a wide-open net of pleasure. The word he uses in the emblem is gusto, that narrows into the death trap of the great satanic fisher of souls. So just as people's proper protection requires the self-sacrifice of the sovereign in the previous emblem, this emblem directs its reader towards a sacrifice of his own pleasure, linking as it does all pleasure to damnation. A watchful, prudent eye must be watchful first and foremost of its own desires, is the image that is that message that we're meant to receive from this emblem. We can see the positive counterpart to this admonition in the 1665, a little bit later, festival book called Luces de Bohemia. Luces de la Aurora. I just flipped forward several hundred years to a great turn of the 20th century book, Luces de la Aurora, or Lights of Dawn. No, exactly. That's true too. In this country, in this emblem, and let me find this one here. This is over on the left side here of the page. We're treated to inversion of the traditional moral of Phaeton's fall. Rather than a cautionary tale of the dangers of uninhibited ambition, of leaving one's natural station in life and flying too high, the author of this wonderful book of emblems, Francisco de la Torre, reads Phaeton as morally exemplary, a self-sacrificing model of altruism whose flaming fate is worthwhile suffering as long as the intent was noble. So the theme of self-directed suffering in the service of greater morality is what we're starting to glean from this reframing that's happening through these this group of emblems. And it's rampant in Covarrubias, especially in the realm of education, where the whip is shown in several cases as being essential to the civilization of students, to their happiness, and even, as in this personalization of the pedagogy of violence, to life itself. And that's what you see. You see the tools of pedagogy, and central in them is actually a whip for flaying people's skin. So the emblem's motto is dolorles doy y juntamente vida. Pain I give them. So it's the personification of this whip. And at the same time, life, says the whip. But it also specifies the kind of students who will benefit from its rigor. The word specifically is lerdos, the oafs and the slow-witted. Those, in other words, who haven't the self-discipline to tame themselves will benefit and even gain life from punishment. But not all students need to be shaped in this way. As Covarrubias writes in another emblem dedicated to the theme of education, this one here, so it's in the very same book. In fact, it's only separated by a few pages. Teachers should spare the whip on well-born children, for whom its rigors are more likely to cause their generous spirits, naturally generous spirits, to cower and make them waste their time in useless exercises. The comparison between these two views on corporal punishment is eye-opening. In agreement with the tendency of this age, Covarrubias accepts a foundational distinction between kinds of men, kinds of people, already present in their children. There are those whose blood destines them to be leaders, whose natural generosity makes the imposition of suffering unnecessary and even potentially detrimental. And for these, literally in Spanish, sons of something, hidalgos, the base term for the gentry of the time, literally signified already having something in them, a proclivity to choose suffering over pleasure. It is meanwhile the oafish, the weak, those lacking in such natural attributes, such lineage, who should not be spared the lash, if only out of duty and compassion for their likely fate, free from its guard. So what I think, to draw us back to the contemporary applications that David was making in the opening, this should make us think about the assumptions of neutrality, immediacy, equality, that lead one to assume that one's position, for example, in life, is a direct and unmediated expression of personal worth. Crucial for any justice system, then, we would argue, and we try to argue in Medialogies, and we talk about media literacy as being fundamental for any kind of social change, is to be self-aware of the sorts of filters that determine our notions of guilt, of innocence, of virtue and responsibility. And the point of the book then is to show how the very strategies that are determining those notions for us today, under the pretense of simply look out there, it's just reality, unmediated, unaltered in any way, are in fact not dependent specifically on technologies, but rather are built into the way that old technologies as well are perfectly capable of manipulating reality. All right.
Thank you, David and Bill, for, I think, this very thought-provoking introduction. Should I use the... Yes. Yeah. So I want to thank David and Bill for this very thought-provoking introduction. And I thought that before we move on to a more interactive Q&A, it might be useful for you to talk a little bit about the framing of your project, because the whole book is structured around a dialogue between what you call the two inflationary ages, the one of the 16th and especially 17th century, and then the contemporary period. And you really base the book on a dialogue between these two time frames, so to speak. And it might be useful for those who maybe haven't not yet read the book or read the entire book, for you to explain how this dialogue provides entry points into understanding some contemporary cultural and political phenomena that you were illustrating, David, at the beginning with some of these examples. So how this comparison between the 16th and especially 17th century and our current period might help us understand some of the things we have been living through in the last few years.
David, can I jump in? Sure. I'll take a start, and then David always comes up with fantastic examples, so he'll just sort of jump in after that. But
now you've killed me there.
No. I have full confidence. In fact, I'll start with an example that you sent to me this morning. So I was walking to meet David, and I get a text from him that says, "Oh, look at this article." And I proceed to read this article on my phone while walking to him. And it is an article about how we're so addicted to technology in our phones that we're getting all of our news by our phones, and we're not even noticing it. I'm reading it and shaking my head and saying, yeah, this is completely true, as I consume the exact, and what I think the point that we want to make is what is in our definition of inflationary media is an inflationary media, again, is somewhat independent from the technological specificity of the media. What inflationary media do, it's a kind of media that causes those who are immersed in its world to begin to lose sight of the distinctions between how that media is framing and the reality of the reality that it is framing. In other words, it's media that necessarily is capable of blurring the frames of representation, of causing us to begin to lose sight of that distinction between what the reality is that we're talking about and the means that we're using to represent and talk about that reality. So we can go from tiny little examples like that to ones from the early modern period. This we don't actually discuss directly in the book, but when theater was introduced and turned really into one of the first performative mass medias throughout the 17th century in more countries than just Spain, throughout Western Europe. At the same time, critics had to start paying attention to, and there was great debates about the unities of, which were like, how do you write a good theater play? And they took very serious the possibility that if they weren't paying attention to unities of time and space, that people might be sitting in the audience and forget that they're actually in an audience watching a play. Now we think about, oh, you have to get to the early 20th century when the Lumiere brothers were showing a film of the train at the Gare de Lyon coming in, and that people would get up and run away because it was a technological innovation. I think this example shows that it isn't necessarily a technological innovation, that you can have critics very seriously debating in the 17th century, when there's no such thing as film or highly realistic images in film, debating the possibility that people are not going to get that what's happening on the stage is in fact a theatrical representation, and we have to instill a certain separation, a certain artificiality to ensure that they don't fall into that trap.
Great, I got my own microphone. Thank you. This is the microphone for examples. All right, so since it put me on the spot, here's an example for you. And in the second quarter of the 16th century, I'm from Granada. Patricia and I were talking about this earlier. The Granada was one of the last bastions of Moorish presence in Spain. 1492 was it's the date of the so-called discovery of America, and the date of the final expulsion of the Moors from Spain, from Granada, and the Jews as well. And it's also the date of the publication of the first Spanish grammar by Nebrija. But in any case, the region of the Alpujarras on the southern side of Sierra Nevada became historically relevant in the second half of the 15th century, when the Moriscos, the descendants of the Moors, rebelled. The rebellion lasted 3 years. It took Philip II 3 years to crush the rebellion, and after executing the leaders and the great carnage that came with the suppression of the rebellion, then the Moriscos of Granada took a different tack. They decided to try a cultural rebellion. And what's interesting is that they must have managed to realize that they had been essentially written out of Spain. They were effectively being written out of Spain by historians, so-called historians, actually many of them disciples of Nebrija, of the well-known grammarian, who had been commissioned by the Habsburgs to write genealogies of Spain, to effectively invent genealogies of Spain, to prove that Spain had been Catholic essentially before Christ, all the way back to Noah's descendants. now, the Moriscos realized that that version of Spain, that reframing of Spain as essentially always already Catholic, was effectively writing them out of existence. They decided to rewrite themselves into history by doing their own reframing. So they put together a nice series of artifacts, of fake archaeological artifacts that they aged artificially. These were the famous lead books of Granada. And they planted these fake archaeological artifacts all over the hills of Granada, on the other side of the Alhambra. A part of Granada that now has been named as Sacro Monte, the sacred mountain. And this naming comes from the planting of these archaeological artifacts. In any case, they were supposed to be found by neutral parties. They were planted to be found by neutral parties. Peasants ended up finding them over a period of months. And they brought them to the authorities of Granada. Of course, the authorities of Granada figured, well, they need to be translated. Who here can speak Arabic? So the same people who planted them received the archaeological artifacts for translation. Now, they were written in Arabic characters, but they were gibberish. They didn't mean anything. And there was a real thinking behind that. They wanted to for these findings, these alternative facts, to have the flexibility to adjust to the times. So basically, they started translating the artifacts, and interactively, in a way, they were kind of gauging the reaction of the Granadinian gentry, and based on their reaction, they would continue the translation. But in essence, what they were constructing was an alternative history of Christianity, in which the first disciples of Christ were Arabs, and they spoke Arabic, which is why Arabic could not be expelled as a language from Spain. So here we have a real case of fake news, fake histories, a fake history against a fake history, reframing against reframing, which essentially brings us back to our present. So this is why we think that this, to look at the two periods of inflationary media side by side, to create a dialogue between them, can be fruitful for us.
Just a quick follow-up, because then I know Patricia has more questions, maybe one or two more, I would imagine. But this also leads directly into what we consider to be the urgency of the call towards the end of Medialogies, and as David has just admitted, we're working on the idea of expanding that, because those who've dialogued with us already about the book have been asking, well, when you call for more humanities at the end of the book, in what shape would that take? And part of our point is that it's not to say, well, look, this set of people who intervened created this set of alternative facts, and they're just responded to by this set of alternative facts. So we can all throw up our hands in the air and say, well, it's all just depends on the framework that's given you. No, we believe that there really is an answer to that, and that is ultimately what the humanities are capable of doing. Philology, looking at text, making decisions on the basis and arguments and interpretations on the basis of textual evidence, and that this is what we call not just media literacy, but which is a part of it, but reality literacy. That if it's true that reality is constantly under assault, if you will, and we have to accept that it is and will be, the best tools for discerning and then ultimately engaging in rational discourse about reality are precisely those that are inculcated and educated and worked on and developed through the disciplines of the humanities. History, philosophy, literary theory, literary history, etc.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question. So what would be the antidote to this proliferation of fake reality upon reality and so on? But I have a number of other questions, but I think that given the time, it might be better to open the floor for questions from the audience or comments or yes, here and then there.
I was just wondering what this new phenomenon of people having a voice and commenting on media which is, I think it is new.
Yeah.
If that, what role does that play in this age of inflationary media? The fact that everyone can comment on an article that is fake, and what happens after everyone's discussing.
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's one that I think demonstrates exactly the cautionary note that we're sounding, right? Because in an age of inflationary media, you're going to have, if you will, what I would call, and I think Debbie would agree with me, a kind of a facade of democratization occurs, right? So, the more people who are commenting and making this point, the more media, the better, the more democratic, and ultimately we get to the truth that way. But we see it doesn't often or necessarily work that way. And that discernment becomes extremely important, right? And that discernment involves, it's not easy, it involves study, it involves education, it involves knowing languages, cultures, precisely that which in the present day end up being de-emphasized by educational regimes that are focused on purely economic and instrumental outputs. No, you have to learn exactly this in order to be able to get a job programming, or you have to learn exactly that. It's probably true that learning exactly the set of skills might get you a job, but it doesn't necessarily expand you as a human being or allow you the sorts of discernment that would permit a truly democratic society to function. David, were you looking?
Yeah, I'm looking for something that.
Going to show us something.
Do you want to take the other question?
Yeah, sure. It was that lady over there.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this. It's intriguing and synergizes a lot with my own thinking over the years. I was a graduate student in the 80s and 90s, and when I'm thinking about, for those who may or may not have been in that scene at that time, but the humanities at that point were in a huge period of self-reflection and crisis almost, of what's come to be called post-structuralism, and I'm not sure what we call it after that, post-structuralism. But the idea that, what I've been reacting to personally coming out environment, when I hear about facts in the media right now, is that there is no such a thing as facts, because that's what I learned in graduate school. Okay, there are no facts. What there is evidence, and then there are cultural constructs that we as a society come to agree upon as facts. And if you look at it more on the science side, and you can, someone like Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, the ways that science comes to the point where it will agree that something is a quote-unquote fact. But at the base of it, it's all an agreement. And what I'm thinking about is, I think I very much look forward to your next book, because I want to hear more about what the humanities can do about this. But I almost wonder if this isn't a natural backlash, because the progression would be, and for those, to politicize it a little. I was also caught up in the culture wars of the time and political correctness. And so I remember having to defend something I said in public once in an alumni magazine, because I was accused of political correctness by a 1950s era graduate who read the quote of what I had said. It was about slavery, the legacy of slavery. And so we had people like Dinesh D'Souza on the Closing the American Mind. I mean, he's still out there on Twitter every day, right, saying bizarre things.
D'Souza wrote Illiberal Education.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Alan Bloom wrote The Closing.
Right, you're right. I got that wrong. Thank you. You're paying more attention to these things in the recent world than I've been. But anyways, that the sort of, to the extent that the academic left is aligned with the post-structuralism that took over much of the humanities and even social sciences in that time, maybe we're in a period of backlash, and I wondered if you could address that aspect.
We are 100% in a period of backlash. There's no question about that. The question that I have is the extent, and I think this is demonstrable, because we like to talk in terms of textual evidence. You can look at plenty of textual evidence and media evidence that that in the 2016 elections, one of the boogeymen that was brought around as those that we need to react to or put down are postmodern professors and famous quotes, "We have become too politically correct," and there was a lot of trashing of political correctness. I think what's interesting is, again, looking at or using our methodology to look how things are framed is to examine to what extent, in fact, political correctness and postmodern professors have the kind of power that is claimed for this kind of to justify this kind of a political reaction. Not only to what extent they have that kind of power, which is in fact, I think, minority and certainly exaggerated in the extreme, but to what extent the interpretations that these sorts of claims are based on are in fact accurate interpretations of what even the philosophers that were being bandied about during the 1980s were in fact saying. So everything is just text. There is no outside to the text. Everything is interpretation, and there is no such thing as truth. Many of these were in fact either quotes taken completely out of context by people who didn't entirely understand or take the time to really confront or deal with the philosophies that they were applying, or were simply fabrications themselves, claims that such and such said this when they didn't actually say it at all. Again, a truly grounded humanistic discipline is one that pays attention to text, that pays attention to history, to standards of evidence, and isn't willing to simply take something do your first Google search, come up with an answer and say, okay, see, this is what happened, and move on from there. I think that's what we need to get back to, a certain skepticism, a certain being aware of what are the grounds of the claims that you're making.
And here's where paying attention to filters really can be useful. So a word like skepticism. The term has been hijacked in outright circles to justify the self-interest of those who would prefer to bury their head in the sand when it comes to global warming. It's our responsibility as humanists to rescue the notion of skepticism from that hijacking. The same can be said about doubt. Doubt is necessary. It's absolutely necessary for thinking. Part of the problem, as we see it with our media technologies, is that it disallows, it frames out the possibility of thinking. It steals time from us, the time that's necessary for thinking. The speed of communications is such that we really have no time to think. Before we can think, we have to doubt. Doubt has been also hijacked by the same forces, the same market forces. So it's, again, a responsibility as humanists to rescue that term from that nefarious place.
So many other terms, liberty, freedom,
faith,
community, faith, have been hijacked and often then become terms that are automatically assumed to have one set of constituents or one kind of audience. No, not necessarily. Look at the history. Look at how these terms have been used in the past. Look at the kind of values that they've managed to mobilize in the past.
And the other point we make in Medialogies is that the place where we find ourselves, this crisis of reality in which we find ourselves, is directly connected to the widespread of fundamentalism that is the result of the siloing of information, of worldview, that comes with a certain usage of social media, for example. And not, so it's not really the result of skepticism taken to its, or this kind of postmodern doubt taken to its ultimate consequence. It's actually the result of fundamentalism, the notion that I can feel justified in my own beliefs regarding of any evidence-based knowledge that may resist it, that may become obstacles to it, to the extent that I can live in my media silo, let's say a combination of Fox News and Breitbart News, feel like my beliefs are reinforced every day. Then I don't really have to talk to people who think differently. That's what we call in the book reality entitlement. So which for us is really a symptom of fundamentalism. And we talk about fundamentalism as being equal to fragmentation, as opposed to this kind of postmodern doubt.
I'm also curious about your views on contemporary literature. So people who study humanities sometimes might get some of the same benefits by reading literature. What are your thoughts about on current literature or current fiction? Yes.
So, for example, you know, I'm just rereading dystopias now. It seems like I'm fascinated by the cultural turns. I think Talia mentioned that in 2016 we co-authored this book called Zombie Talk. It was a time in which zombies had become very prevalent, and I was interested in reading zombies as a symptom of our anxieties. You know, you can think of vampires as attractive, and you know we could even imagine the possibility that we would want to become vampires in some way, shape, or form. But zombies, who would want to become a zombie? So really, that kind of brought me into thinking about why the popularity of zombies, what kinds of anxieties, you know, individual and collective anxieties were being exercised or dealt with through the representation of zombies. And I think that at this point, you know, I mentioned that 1984 was the #1 best-selling book in January 2017. The success of The Handmaid's Tale is another example.
But then it's going back to the classics. It's not really drawing from what's being published now. I'm just curious about that.
Right. Well, so there is a new wave of dystopias right now. They are coming out like crazy. Within 5 or 10 years, we're going to have to re-examine the whole canon of dystopias. They are coming out with incredible speed, and we have to once again try to figure out what is it that makes dystopias such powerful tools today to comment on our world. And the same thing could be said about humor. So I showed a couple of books there by Stephen Colbert, but there is more of a in some ways it's going back to we are going back to a time where the traditional genre divisions don't hold that well. So we go, talk show commentators now are authors, book authors, and the other way around. We have shows that turn into books and books that turn into shows. But the theme of irony is another very powerful weapon right now in our world, and this speaks to a certain need that we have to we believe to examine filters. And irony is a very powerful weapon to do that, because it implies a certain obliqueness that allows us to see a double image, sort of in an anamorphic way.
We think one of the potential powers of literature and reading books, not just analytic books and nonfiction books, but actually fictional books, is the power that the literature and the written word in particular. We do analyze television shows and we talk about movies, but that literature and the written word has of focusing the attention on invisible filters, right? And you don't see these filters per se, but they're there, the filters that we spend the entire book talking about. Literature can animate the senses to pay attention to how a reality is posed for someone who's living in it, how a particular media environment situates something for someone who's imbued or immersed in that media environment. We talk a lot about Cervantes, which is of course old literature, but we also make the argument, and it's one that I then went into great length to work out in my intellectual biography of Cervantes, the man who invented fiction, that why I make this outlandish sounding claim that he invented fiction is because we have certain expectations in modern fiction, all of which can be traced back to what he was able to do with the text. It was precisely that. Our expectations of characters as being three-dimensional, people that we can somehow relate to, that integrate themselves with our sense of empathy, was something that he created. And how did he do it? By making other characters who are both bewildered by and capable of analyzing and thinking critically about their relationship between to media and to the truth that lie on the other side of that media. So I think often about a wonderful interview, and you should look it up. It's I can't remember what publication published it, but it was an interview between the novelist Marilyn Robinson and our former president, in which he expressed this. He's a great reader of novels himself, and he expressed this worry in an age that is reading less and less literature in the sense of the presentation of realistic characters that we can have empathetic relationships with. What is it doing to our capacity to empathize? And the neuroscientific research on precisely that topic does give some credence to the president's sense of alarm, right? Because apparently reading novels, and more than any other form of consumption of fictional narratives, in other words, media that present things in what McLuhan would call a hotter way, where you have less of an ability to filter and use your own imagination to create. Reading novels in particular ignites our ability to empathize with those who are different from us, right? And this is something that we see in the history of the modern novel from as far back as Miguel de Cervantes up to novelists like Valeria Luiselli or Ove Knausgaard or so many others that I can think of.
Any other questions? I do have a question. You refer in the book that today's medialogy turns copies into things, so things that proliferate as copies become reality, and this tends to sideline reality itself, right? And you link this to the current ecological crisis, because reality as such becomes expandable, and so you can just dispose of it. And I was wondering if you see also literature or the creative arts, let's call them like this, as a way to counter this phenomenon.
I think very much we do, and we think of literature and creativity in the arts as one of the only ways of countering this phenomenon. So what you're referring to is in the second age of media that turns copies into things, our idea of the world of the totality of the world as being a representation. It gets packaged into something that is itself bottomless, so the world is that which supports us becomes something like a commodity. It means it has an end. It can be thought of as a resource that we can expend. And of course we need to think about it in those terms, but at the same time, once we think of the very source of life itself, of everything that we are, not as something infinite and grounding, but as one, granted, very, very big and important, but one resource among many, this kind of opens the door into a scary future, right? You begin to think about everything in terms of as potential commodities. People are commodities. Life sources are commodities, as opposed to thinking about what is the potential value of these sources, of these things in their own terms, not in terms of what they might be calculable in dollars. We do find that art and literature are precisely anchors that keep us from falling entirely over the cliff in that sense.
Yeah, and we also we mentioned the tourist industry as sort of the ultimate paradigm of that kind of dialectic of negation that takes place. In the book, we also mentioned a recent example of the American Airlines mural that's displayed over the JFK security area, where it's called the city, the skyline of the world, and it shows a rather unreal Disney World-like picture of globalization, where you have the Eiffel Tower with the Empire State Building, with other landmarks throughout the world,
the skyline of the world. As you walk through security, the reality of you having to take your shoes off, take your belt off, do a spread eagle. And I'm talking as a Spaniard now. I don't know how much of this you actually share of this reality. But as a Spaniard who shaves only inconsistently, coming through security, it's the notion that on the one hand you have unlimited movement on the screen of the mural, where you are a citizen, you are being interpolated as a citizen, a global citizen, a citizen of that skyline of the world. And at the same time that you're taking your belt off and going through increasingly oppressive, measures that show you the exact opposite. That kind of that opens up the room for questioning. To what extent is that image of the world is true, and what is it negating? Like the tourist industry, or like Disney World, it negates oppression. Colonialism.
The 90% of the world's population who doesn't have the capacity to simply walk through security to another country.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's part of the thinking. It's once we look at the world in these terms, once we train ourselves in the art of reality literacy, in a way. You can apply that skill to literature, to the American Airlines mural, to the tourist industry, in search for that elusive manifestation of the truth in the filter itself.
Well, I'd like to thank David and Bill for this wonderful presentation. I believe there is going to be a book signing outside. So first of all, thank you for...
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.